You're on the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouts. It's July 1st, 2018. We're looking at the invisible war. You know, the war that you really can't see, that's been waging ever since Adam and Eve. Actually, it went before that, but it impacts our life. We've been looking at this invisible war, its implications for the last 6 episodes here. This is number 7. It's entitled, Where Are We Now? Because we've spent 6 sessions looking at the broad overview of God's dealing with mankind. It's an overview that hopefully provided some context for what we see happening. For example, why do young children, infants, have a penchant for disobedience, for wanting what they want no matter what? Why do societies follow that same pattern? Why do societies need so many rules, so many laws, so many control mechanisms? If human beings are basically good, none of that would be necessary. You do realize the animal kingdom doesn't suffer from this malady. They come in with instinct, and they just do what those animals do. You might think it's nasty, but that's what they do. But rules are necessary. And as we move ever closer to the end of the age, they seem to become more necessary. And at the same time, less understandable, at least by the majority. The biblical narrative of beginnings, the Bible says it's the book of Genesis, is routinely dismissed by those who seem to have the knowledge and skill to know. All human beings springing from original parents created from the dust of the earth by an almighty God? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, evolving up from primordial life forms to become the magnificent creatures they are now? Oh, wait, we can't use the word creature here. The magnificent production or beings they are now. That seems more useful. Recently, there have been a spate of discoveries that really decry the evolutionary model. One of the most recent is something called the Antikythera mechanism. Never heard of it. It's reported to be the oldest computer ever made. It's 2,000 years old. That's the time of Christ. It has a clock mechanism that predicts planetary and solar movements, moon phases, lunar and solar eclipses. There is no similar technology prior to the 16th, 17th century. There's the well-known Rosetta Stone from the late Minoan Bronze Age. That's 3,500 to 1,200 BC. It has 242 symbols that no one has yet deciphered. Then there's DNA in the bacteria of some fossils, indicating they are 400 million years old. Except that DNA could not last more than several thousands of years. Can you say, oops? It's an illustration of science, so-called, in search of proof, rather than the other way around. Then there's the known population of the Earth in 1810, which stood at about 1 billion people. In less than 200 years, that population ratcheted up to 6 billion. And all you'd have to do is the math. We got millions of years of evolution. There should be trillions of dead human beings cluttering up the ground just in the last million years. But there isn't. Also, the known decay rate of the Earth's magnetic field proves no life could have existed here just a mere 25,000 years ago. Then there's the salt levels in the ocean. Scientists know About 457 million tons of salt are being deposited in the oceans every year. Only 122 million tons leave the ocean by several means. If the evolutionist is correct, the ocean should already be saturated by salt. The saturation point would be about 62 million years ago. We live in a very young Earth by evolutionary standards. Then there's the pyramids of Egypt. The skill and the knowledge it took to build these monuments defies anything an evolving human being should have been able to do at that time in history. So they tend to credit visitors from other worlds. Or now, just recently, they pushed evolution back 800,000 years to make some of this stuff fit. A study was presented to the International Conference of Geoarchaeological and Archaeomineralogy held in Sofia. It's called Geological Aspects of the Problem of Dating the Great Egyptian Sphinx Construction. Apparently this was in 2008. Or they suggest other beings from other planets did all this. Why? Well, because no human being could possibly have had the skills necessary if they were built when they appear to have been built. Keep in mind, the Bible speaks of Moses during the period when pharaohs were building pyramids and so forth. Part of the invisible war is Satan's effort to keep man at the top of the heap and God at the bottom. Nothing of God could possibly be viewed as good, and nothing of mankind can possibly be viewed as bad. To do so would be to disrupt and to thwart Satan's ultimate purpose, and nothing is apparently off limits. Can you say transgenderism? At another time, these folks would have been labeled mentally deranged and placed in hospitals. Think about it. A new species that cannot reproduce? Even nature wouldn't do such a thing. Nature doesn't do such a thing. There seems to be no limit to how far a human being will go to either denigrate or destroy any semblance of God. Such is the effect of sin upon the species, aided by the archenemy of God. But the testimony of God still stands. And the history of mankind supports it. A species apart from the animal kingdom. A species corrupted by selfism and pride. A species left to its own ideas, which will degenerate and destroy if they are not stopped. Science assures us that Homo sapien has evolved upward from the ooze and from the simple to the complex, but our social structure and our religious ideals demonstrate something completely opposite. We know more today, and yet we have less creativity and mental acuity. I'm talking about the average person, not the few who actually excel. We are more connected today, and yet we have fewer friends, fewer neighbors, and even family members we can rely upon. We are more mobile and more tech savvy today, and we've never been more isolated. In the last 50 years, there have been more religious organizations and more so-called Christian churches started and or built. And yet, we are farther from God today than at any point in our history as a nation. We have a huge amount of disposable income today. Cars that cost what houses did 50 years ago. Closets filled with clothes instead of the 4 or 5 outfits in the 1950s. Cupboards with so much food we don't know what to eat next. houses that were called mansions just 100 years ago. We have time for anything we really want. We're no longer tied to the farm. We have technology that gives us truly a window on the world. And we do it on our phones. Cars with air conditioning and technology unknown to the 1950s sci-fi. We are in touch with one another every minute of every day, and yet we know less about one another and less about life than any other generation. And the most grievous is our lack of information, our lack of relationship with God. If we have it, it's largely superficial, limited to 1 hour a week or less, consisting of a few moral codes and lots of upbeat music. What in the world happened? Well, sin happened. A once morally perfect human being thought more of himself than of his God, took matters into his own hands, and did the one thing his God told him not to do. There was only one limitation God placed on Adam, and he either couldn't or wouldn't obey that. Why? Well, at heart, he imagined himself above God. He could make this decision, and God would surely fix it. He could make this decision, and surely it wouldn't be as God said. He could make this decision and somehow recover from it. The idea of absolute obedience did not inform his choice. Why? Because God gave him that option. Would this human being simply obey God for God's sake? Or would he view himself equal with God and justify sin, justify rebellion? Now, it seems everyone knew what he would do, except for him. God knew. Apparently, Satan either knew or thought he would. And the temptation, a simple thing like eating a certain fruit, was it all that important? Yeah. Why? Simply because God told him not to. Can you do what you're told? Now, I don't think there was anything special in that fruit that would give him special knowledge or power. It was simply his disobedience, his willingness to ignore the God who made him in favor of his own physical, emotional desires. It was a momentary thing, the results of which have impacted every human being, every human decision, every human desire since that day. The overarching testimony: obey God and live. Disobey God? To your peril. In that moment, everything changed spiritually for Adam, for Eve, and physically as well. There was an immediate estrangement illustrated by their now need to cover those naked bodies when the Lord came in the evening, to hide themselves from God symbolically, and ultimately to be driven from the presence of God. The God who met with them in the cool of the evening would now be aloof and far off. The biblical narrative shows very few times after that when God made himself known to man. And then to only specific people in private times for specific purposes. The first baby born to these parents would grow up to rebel, to reject their God. His name was Cain, and he is the father of all who hate God. His son Canaan would give his name to the people group which stood in the way of the children of Israel as they sought to inhabit the land God gave them. They were called Canaanites. Biblically, if the people group was known by a name ending in "ite," it was probably related to Cain or Canaan. And if not, at least to those who hate God. Even to this day, God raised up a people called Israel to represent Him in the world, to stand in the gap and to make Him known until the Redeemer would come. A man fully God, fully man, who would pay the awful price of the kinsman Redeemer, buying back the world of men with His own blood, buying it back from Satan, who stole it from God through Adam. Under the ancient laws, the Redeemer would then own the property. The hirelings and others may continue to live on the land and receive value from it, but only until the owner physically came to take possession. When he comes, he throws the interlopers off and he takes up residence. And then and only then is the transaction complete. This is what Jesus is doing. On the cross, He paid the price. And He went away. But He's coming back. At the end of the Great Tribulation, He will return. He will return with His bride, the church, with the friends of the bridegroom, the redeemed of the world prior to Christ. And He will come with His army. He will come to set up His kingdom in Jerusalem, to drive off the interlopers, and to rule the world for 1,000 years. A righteous rule, a time when the kings of the earth will be required to appear before Him once each year and pay homage. Failure will mean a dearth of productivity for the next year. You see, it will be a very legalistic time, something human beings understand. Something apparently most human beings will not appreciate. For at the end of that time, Satan will be loosed and able to recruit a mighty army of men to attack the king and try to depose him. That battle is called the Battle of Armageddon. But if you read closely, there's no battle. There is the gathering of war, and God destroys them. There is only the fire of God descending upon them, destroying them all. And after that, we see the great white throne judgment, when, as the Bible tells us, the dead, both small and great, will stand before the judge. The judge is Jesus. Jesus is now sitting in judgment. This will be all those who have ever lived upon the earth. And they will be judged from the books, the Bible says. The books that record their deeds. And it sounds like they want to be judged by that methodology. However, unless their names were found written in that other book, the Lamb's Book of Life, it really won't matter what they did or didn't do. They will be condemned to hellfire forever and ever. The Bible says where their worm, their life force, will never die, never cease, where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth forever and ever. Why? Because they insisted on being the God of their own lives, right up to the end. They honestly believed they deserved heaven. They refused to bow their heart to any other. They lived a spiritually prideful life upon this earth, and now they will receive what the holy God of heaven considers just. And it will be an eternity in punishment.